Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden in London, and these are the stories that set your agenda. A power vacuum in Syria after rebels depose Bashar al-Assad, forcing him to flee to Russia. Israel moves troops into Syrian territory, and the US strikes dozens of ISIS targets. South Korean stocks lead declines in Asia, with President Yoon facing more calls to resign and a potential travel ban. In China, inflation eases ahead of a key economic meeting. Plus, President-elect Donald Trump says he has no plans to replace Fed Chair Jerome Powell when he takes office next month. A very good morning. Welcome to a new week. Monday, the 9th of December. It's set to be a busy week for central banks against a backdrop of political instability around the world. So let's check in on these markets. We had the S&P 500 notching a new record, the 57th record of the year on Friday, off the back of that jobs report, spurring bets for a December Fed rate cut. We've got futures currently pointing lower but pretty flat stateside, and in Europe a mixed picture but slightly lower on the Euro Stoxx 50, so a risk-off mood. But flipping the board over to the cross-asset picture, all eyes turn now to the US CPI print on Wednesday. Is this going to nail on that December Fed cut? We've got the 10-year US Treasury yield at 4.13% currently. Euro dollar a touch weaker at a 105 handle, lower 0.3%. This with the risk-off mood, given what's happening in Syria, and we'll get to that in a moment. But that's also pushing up Brent. Oil trading higher 0.6% at $71 a barrel, and Bitcoin just shy of that $100,000 mark that it hit last week. But we're going to get into that with the Binance CEO later in the programme. But let's get now to the latest in Syria. Bashar al-Assad having landed in Moscow after Islamist-led forces led a lightning advance through Syria, entering the capital on Saturday evening and ending more than half a century of his family's rule. Assad's toppling comes after more than a decade of war, 600,000 deaths, and the world's worst refugee crisis since World War II.
The fall of the regime is a fundamental act of justice. It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their proud country. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty.
Well, Bloomberg's Sam Dagger joins us now. Sam, I've been following your reporting over the weekend, and what I want to ask you is bad news for Assad necessarily good news for the people of Syria?
Well, overwhelmingly, I mean, they're saying it's good news for them now. I mean, you have to remember that, they've been suffering under this regime, I mean, this family based regime for over half a century. I mean, we have to remember that Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez, came to power in a coup d'etat in 1970, and he built one of the most brutal regimes in the world, underpinned by repression, violence, and this cult of personality. Syrians rose up against his son, who had inherited power from his father in 2000. I mean, we have to remember, Syria is only by name a republic. I mean, on the paper, it is a republic, but it could be, for all intents and purposes, it is a monarchy. I mean, in terms of how power has been handed over to the son. And they rose up against him, and he met them with bullets, and then the popular uprising turned into war. External actors came in, a horrendous death toll, anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 killed, half the population of 24 million displaced either internally or outside the country, and 100,000 at least forcibly displaced by the regime. So now that they're opening the prisons, people are wondering whether their loved ones were there in prison. So Syrians are still getting their bearings. I mean, yes, you see these scenes of celebrations in Damascus and elsewhere, and obviously millions of Syrians outside Syria who had been displaced and could not go back to their country also were celebrating. So we have to keep that in mind, that people are just coming to grips with this. Syrians.
But as they get their bearings, of course, the question now turns to what happens next. And I wonder how strong these HTS rebels are, whether they're likely to keep hold of power in Syria, or who else is waiting in the wings to challenge them.
That is an excellent question. I think we have, yes, while there were the HTS, I mean, this is the Hayat Tahrir Sham, led by a man known by his nom de guerre, Al-Julani, but now is using his real name, Ahmad al-Shara. He entered Damascus yesterday, but he commands about 15,000 fighters. I mean, he was previously affiliated to Al-Qaeda. I mean, and the organization, his organization was called the Nusra Front, and he personally fought in Iraq against the Americans and was captured there. I mean, he fought with Al-Qaeda. So that's what we're dealing with. But he has gone out of his way to assure Syrians and assure the world that he has changed his colors. I mean, and as kind of a proof of that, he told the prime minister who's in place now, the prime minister who had been appointed by Assad in September, to remain in place, the prime minister and the government to run the affairs of the country until there is an orderly transition. And in the meantime, you know, the political opposition, which is all exiled, is meeting in places like Ankara, Istanbul, and primarily in Qatar, to try to figure out, you know, what they do. But you have to remember that those, you know, political opposition outside, they have no power on the ground. I mean, they have to work with these fighters. And then you have other factions, for instance, a group in the south that actually raced to Damascus. This is a group in Dara. It even got there ahead of the HTS commander, and then you have other factions. So, and these factions have actually fought each other in the past. And then you have, I mean, it is really complicated. You have also the Kurdish militias in the northeast that have a totally different agenda. They want autonomy for the Kurds, and they've been fighting other rebel factions that are backed by Turkey. So dizzyingly complex, but obviously a lot of countries in the region, and I would say even around the world, are taking a wait-and-see attitude at the moment.
Well, exactly. And Israel, of course, watching on. And indeed, its forces have overtly crossed into Syrian territory for the first time since the 1973 October War. They've passed the demilitarized border zone. How significant is that, Sam? And what do we know? Hugely
significant, yes. I mean, we are hearing those reports. I mean, I'm talking to people who are confirming those reports. I mean, talking to people in Damascus last night who are saying, again, we as Bloomberg, we haven't confirmed this yet, but they are saying that there were also Israeli airstrikes against a number of facilities. There is this place in central Damascus called the Security Quarter. I mean, that's where all the headquarters of all the security services, and a lot of these buildings were up in flames last night, and people were saying it was, you know, an Israeli strike. And also there was this research center on the outskirts of Damascus where the regime developed chemical weapons. I mean, let's remember, this regime used chemical weapons against its own people starting in 2012. And that facility was bombed. So Israel is clearly worried about weapons, coming into the hands of these rebels that it doesn't trust at the moment.
All right, Bloomberg's Sam Dagger, we thank you for that excellent, crucial reporting and the context as well. Thank you so much. Now, let's turn to the political crisis in South Korea. Stocks slumping as traders brace for volatility because of that turmoil. Yonhap News has reported that police may seek the emergency arrest of President Yoon if conditions are met. And that, of course, follows this weekend's failed impeachment attempt. We can get more now with Bloomberg's Katia Dmitrieva. Katia, there's this enormous pressure on President Yoon to step down. Unions threatening to strike unless he does. Can he last? What's the latest?
Yes, that's the big question right now, and it's looking increasingly unstable. His position just in general, amid all the uncertainty that's been happening over the last week. We're now entering the second week of this instability in South Korea. And if you listen to the main party, the PPP, that's Yoon's party, what they've said is that he's not actually the one making decisions right now, that as of Sunday, it's actually the prime minister and the party in consultation who are making decisions for the country as Yoon prepares sort of his exit to step down. Of course, the opposition party, the main opposition party, the Democratic Party, are not happy with that, and they say it's unconstitutional. And they're looking on Wednesday to have another vote seeking impeachment of the president. Now, they're going to have to try to find some votes that they couldn't find on Saturday. So the numbers are still not looking like it might add up to an impeachment. But the next, 24, 48 hours, we could see a lot of movement because, as we've heard, the police have launched this investigation. They're seeking to potentially prevent Yoon from leaving the country, as well as all the allegations that have been made in recent days. And on top of that, you have his own party, Yoon's own party, that are saying he's not actually the one calling the shots right now, plus all the protests we've been seeing on the ground. So really incredibly getting volatile for President Yoon and looking increasingly less likely that he'll be able to hold on to his position.
All right, Bloomberg's Katia Dmitrieva, we thank you for the latest on the political situation there in Korea. Let's get to the market reaction now. We can go to Avril Hong in Singapore with a look at the Kospi, the Won and broader Asia markets. Avril.
Yeah, Lizzie, we're seeing that expectation of a prolonged, protracted political crisis in South Korea. That's really what's hitting stocks in the country today. The Kosdaq, I wanted to highlight, this is the small cap gauge, is losing by the most since August. Not only that, it's actually at the lowest level since April 2020. This is the early days of the pandemic. Why is this significant? Because this is a rare signal in terms of its underperformance versus the benchmark Kospi. This is something that we really don't see. And this tells us that even retail investors in South Korea are souring in terms of sentiment towards the nation's stocks. They perhaps don't see a quick turnaround, and this is following on from what we're already expecting from these foreign investors. The other thing to highlight when you see this underperformance, we saw this similarly in 2016, 2017 when politicians were seeking the impeachment of another president. And back then, the picture versus now is quite different because Korean investors have options. US stocks, cryptocurrencies, all in doesn't bode well for South Korean equities. The won, lowest level against the greenback in more than 2 years. Flip the board. I wanted to talk you through what we're seeing in China as well, because today we did get CPI numbers that showed you an unexpected slowing in consumer inflation in the country. So it just shows you how whatever policymakers have been throwing at the Chinese economy in terms of stimulus, that just hasn't cut it, not enough to revive the economy. Stocks, they're underperforming. Where we are seeing buying is in Chinese bonds, perhaps the expectation of more easing, fresh lows on the yield on the 10-year in the country. Lizzie.
All right, Avril Hong in Singapore, we thank you. Keeping a close eye on Korea and China. But as we broaden out our thinking on global markets, let's get to the US as well, where President-elect Donald Trump says he has no plans to replace Fed Chair Jerome Powell when he returns to the White House. Trump was speaking in an interview on NBC's Meet the Press with Kristen Welker.
I don't see it, but I think if I told him to, he would. But if I asked him to, he probably wouldn't. But if I told him to, he would.
You don't have plans to do that right now?
No, I don't.
Well, let's bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Hetal now. Of course, Val, we had Jay Powell saying last week he doesn't expect tensions with the incoming administration. I wonder whether you believe that and whether the market's buying it as well.
Look, Lizzie, the Fed chair will come under a lot of heat with the new president-elect Donald Trump taking office in January. But markets were very much watching that interview, the first one since he won the election, for any new hints on tariff policy. We didn't necessarily get that. He was strong on tariffs when it came to Canada. But the lack of new news when it came to those tariff announcements from Donald Trump. We are seeing the Bloomberg Dollar Index just slightly stronger overnight. Those S&P futures are hovering near all-time highs. They hit a new record on Friday after that employment report. And the U.S. 10-year yield, we're still seeing a strong rally in treasuries. That rally on Friday is continuing. The biggest risk event this week, though, for U.S. assets is going to be Wednesday's U.S. CPI report. If we flip on, just look at how the U.S. inflation has moderated recently. we've actually seen a slight pickup in the month-on-month readings, which has led the 3-month annualized reading to now be above the 2% Fed's target. Many out there are expecting that maybe a hot print on Wednesday could put that Fed cut in December in question. What else we have to watch out for this week, Lizzie, is other central bank meetings. We have a slew of them this week. Beginning with tomorrow, we hear from the RBA. We also get on Wednesday the Bank of Canada. They're expected to do a jumbo 50 basis point cut after an unexpected rise in their unemployment rate on Friday. We also hear from the Central Bank of Brazil. Then on Thursday, we get the ECB. They're releasing their macroeconomic projections alongside their rate decision. That will be a good one to watch for the market. And we also get the SNB. That's the Swiss National Bank. They're in Switzerland. They're expected to cut as well, but the market is maybe assuming that they could be on a quicker path to get towards the easing territory.
But of course, we question the value of those ECB forecasts with the uncertainty around the politics in France and Germany and those Trump tariffs. Bloomberg's Valerie Hetal, we thank you for that look ahead. Coming up on the programme, Syrians celebrate the fall of Bashar al-Assad. We'll look at the country's next chapter and which regional powers stand to lose out. That's coming up next. And we'll be speaking to the CEO of Binance, Richard Teng, on the recent surge in Bitcoin, as well as optimism around crypto regulation. So don't miss that later this hour. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression.
So that was Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu in a video posted on X. And I'm joined now for more on the situation in Syria by Mehmet Ozalp, professor at the Center for Islamic Studies and Civilisation at Charles Sturt University. Professor, thank you so much for making time. First of all, how will the Assad family be remembered in Syria?
Unfortunately, they will be remembered as brutal tyrants. Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad, have ruled Syria for 54 years. And in that time, they have suppressed any dissent and, diverse voices. A lot of people were arrested, tortured in prisons, and we are seeing examples of that when the prisons are released. Hafez al-Assad is known for 1982 Hama raising of the whole city with the rebels there, and at least 10,000 people, up to 40,000 estimates, have died. And former President Bashar al-Assad could have been better. He showed some promise initially, but with Arab Spring in 2011 onwards, he chose a path of hardline suppression of any dissent and opposition. And as a result, more than 600,000 people have died and millions are displaced or refugees. And they will be remembered for these major damages done to the country.
Well, in terms of those people displaced, migration, of course, at the forefront of the political debate here in Europe. I'm wondering where the refugees are likely to go, who they're likely to be, and really how many supporters Assad had.
Well, there is an expectation that the refugees that escaped the country during Assad government will return back. And we've seen that in the statement of the new leadership of Syria. They've put attracting back the refugees or their own citizens back to Syria. So we could be seeing a reversal of refugees from Europe and Turkey back into Syria as Syria develops and stabilizes.
And I know that HTS has tried to portray itself as more moderate since it broke away from al-Qaeda in 2016. But how would you characterize the group, and what's likely to unfold in Syria now under its rule?
Well, what victors say at the moment of triumph are important. They usually brings out their true nature. And HTS have certainly said the right things. They gave the right messages. For example, they said that there will be no retribution in the country for previous regimes' mistakes and sins. That's a very important sign to bring stability, because these people could rise up and rebel again now to the new leadership. So they said the right thing. They talked about reconciliation. They mentioned being tolerant to ethnic and religious minorities in the country. You have to be like that if you're going to govern Syria. It's a very diverse country, and they're saying the right things. But we have to be cautiously optimistic, or still cautious, because HTS do come from the Al-Qaeda. They split from Al-Qaeda in 2016, which was a long time. And in a recent CNN interview, the leader, Mohammed Al-Julani, said that they're now older and wiser, and their thoughts and views on Islam have moderated. I think we haven't seen anything wrong said or done so far, but of course, we don't know what the future will entail.
Yeah, just finally, Professor, very briefly, given this took Russia, the US, Iran by surprise, are there other countries that we should be watching more carefully now?
Well, Russia and Iran are the biggest losers of this conflict. They're completely out of Syria. And new players are Turkey. The United States will be an important player. And through United States, Israel put pressure on the new Syrian leadership. And these are the main powers. And European Union and NATO will also be an important element. So they will all be on a negotiation table at the moment in order to recognize the new leadership. These countries will put some conditions.
All right. Mehmet Ozalp, Professor at the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilisation at Charles Sturt University. Really great to get your insights this morning. We thank you. Coming up on the programme, we're going to be speaking to Richard Teng, CEO of Binance. We'll discuss Bitcoin's recent rally, touching $100,000, and the impact of a Trump presidency on the crypto industry. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Now to some other stories making news around the world. Ukraine's president says 43,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died since Russia began its invasion in 2022. Volodymyr Zelensky posted the figure on X after Donald Trump claimed on his Truth Social platform that Ukraine had lost 400,000 soldiers. The pair met in Paris on the weekend, with Zelensky saying he stressed the need for, quote, effective peace guarantees from Kyiv's allies. President-elect Donald Trump has said on his first day in office he will pardon the rioters involved in the attack on the US Capitol on January the 6th, 2021. Trump confirmed the news in an interview with NBC's Meet the Press, his first network TV interview since his election victory. Trump's comments follow President Joe Biden's decision to offer a pardon to his son, Hunter Biden. And New York police have released new images of the suspected gunman in the killing of health insurance executive Brian Thompson, including one of him in a taxi that he used after the shooting. Investigators say the suspect hailed the cab on the Upper West Side of Manhattan soon after the attack, heading to a bus station to leave the city. And Omnicom is reportedly in advanced talks to buy Interpublic in a deal that would create the world's largest advertising firm. The Wall Street Journal says the all-stock transaction would value Interpublic at between $13 and $14 billion. Those are some of our top stories coming up on the programme. We're going to be speaking to the CEO of Binance, the world's biggest cryptocurrency exchange by trading volume. We'll discuss Bitcoin's recent record rally. That's next. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden in London, and these are the stories that set your agenda. A power vacuum in Syria after rebels depose Bashar al-Assad, forcing him to flee to Russia. Israel moves troops into Syrian territory, and the US strikes dozens of ISIS targets. South Korean stocks lead declines in Asia, with President Yoon facing more calls to resign and a potential travel ban. In China, inflation eases ahead of a key economic meeting. And President-elect Donald Trump says he has no plans to replace Fed Chair Jerome Powell when he takes office next month. Those are your headlines. Checking in on these markets as we kick off the week, and it's a cautious start to this new week. We had the S&P 500 notching its 57th record of the year last week off the back of that US jobs report, spurring bets for a December Fed cut. But we've got futures in Europe pointing lower now, at least on the Euro Stoxx 50. FTSE 100 futures flat to the upside, and on Wall Street futures flat to the downside. But if we flip over to the cross-asset picture, the question now, as Valerie Hetal set out for us, is really whether that US CPI print on Wednesday will seal the deal on that Fed cut. You've got Treasury yields steady on the 10-year at 4.13%, euro dollar at a 105 handle, under pressure slightly from the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, putting pressure there, partly a risk-off trade. That's feeding into the oil price, Brent trading at $71 a barrel, and Bitcoin just shy of $100,000. But let's get into Bitcoin now. It crossed that $100,000 mark last week for the first time, on the optimism that President-elect Trump is going to support the digital asset industry. As I say, it's just shy of that now. But let's go now to Abu Dhabi, where I'm delighted to be joined by the CEO of the world's biggest cryptocurrency exchange by trading volume. That's Binance's Richard Teng. Richard, thank you so much for making time for us. We've seen Donald Trump picking pretty crypto-friendly picks in the form of his AI czar and in the form of his SEC chair. Where does that likely change in the regulatory stance in the US leave you at Binance?
Well, I do think that if you look at 2024, it's a landmark year, right? So if you tell people before 2024, Bitcoin will hit 100,000, there'll be ETF being approved for Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, and several others. And as well as institutions, I mean, the largest asset manager in the world, BlackRock, has gone from a skeptic to believer. I think people will not believe it. But come to the end of 2024, all those have come true. We have now a very crypto-friendly president in the States and extremely smart strategy appointing an AI and crypto czar on that front, because this too represents the most innovative technology for the future, and countries will do extremely well. I mean, Abu Dhabi this week, the capital of capital, again, Abu Dhabi and UAE has been very foresightful in that front to start investing AI, blockchain, to move those very early on. So we are seeing the results of all those deployment in Abu Dhabi and UAE now. So countries will do very, very, very well to continue to focus on these two technology. And we will continue to focus on serving our fast expanding user base. We're close to 250 million users globally now, 70 million onboarded this year alone. So we are very excited with the journey ahead.
But of course, Binance is under monitorship by the US DOJ and the US Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Would you be looking to press the Trump administration to shorten or terminate the monitorships, given the president-elect's kind of preference, as we say, for looser crypto regulation?
Well, I mean, any of those discussion, I think, is new. I believe that compliance is the way to go, right? So Binance has always been a user-first organization. But going forward, given that regulations is going to be much clearer throughout the world, we have the ability to invest very heavily in compliance space. I want to make compliance a competitive advantage for ourselves, right? So last year alone, we invested $213 million just on our compliance program, which is a more than 30% increase compared to the year before. And this year, it go up even more. We are the most licensed and regulated exchange globally now. We have more than 20 different jurisdictions that license and regulate us. More recently in places, exciting places like India and Argentina. So we are working with global policymakers, lawmakers, to really support the crypto journey, support the crypto deployment. And we continue to work very closely with US monitors on that front to continue to see whether there are areas that we can enhance the program further. I think is a good competitive advantage. We are able to invest in places that our competitors are not being able to invest in.
Well, yeah, are you looking to re-enter that US market then more forcefully? And if they introduce a stablecoin framework, would you be reviving Binance USD, BUSD, or would you be launching a similar token perhaps?
Well, globally, we are supporting crypto adoption, so on different fronts, right? So stable coins, other innovation in this space, cross-border payment, et cetera, et cetera. Whether we re-enter the US market, I think that's a premature discussion. As of now, we are focusing on our global deployment. We are growing very, very quickly. And we're very happy with the progress of what we are seeing. I think this year alone, if you look at the net inflows into Binance, it crosses more than 20 billion, right? If you put our net inflows versus the 10 largest exchange, the next 10 largest exchange put together, we are 40% much more than the 10 largest exchange put together. So you can see the phenomenal growth. We have seen a lot of new institutions being onboarded. And with the US going to announce a Bitcoin strategic reserve and Brazil considering it, I do believe that many other countries around the world will start to deploy on that front. So it's not only the countries, it's the sovereign wealth funds, institutions, foundations, endowments, high net worth individuals. So they're going to start allocating this space. So the future is extremely bright.
Well, so you've been in post for just over a year now, Richard. I wonder what you would say are the biggest changes you've implemented in that time. And as you look ahead, are you planning to add more independent advisors to your board, for example?
Well, we have a strong board of directors today. We have a board of directors of 7, 3 independent directors. We have an independent chairman. So we are in a very good place in terms of corporate structure. I think we have really moved from a founder, CEO-led company to a board-led company. So the senior management of the company work very closely with the board of directors to chart the strategy and the deployment of the company going forward, right? And we are continuing to move from strength to strength. We have not only focused on our investors, our users, we invest a lot into security, and I mentioned compliance, and all those are key areas. I mean, this year alone, you see plenty of exchanges being hacked around the world, right? So Japan, WazirX in India, Indodex in Indonesia, BTC Turk, and the list goes on. So this is an area that we focus a lot of attention to. I mean, we are the exchange that set aside more than 1 billion just to compensate users just in the event of untoward event of a security hack, right, on that front in the form of SAFU fund. So we go beyond what many regulators prescribe in terms of user protection and helping our users detect, deter fraud and scams on that front, helping them avoid 2.4 billion in terms of potential losses just for the first half of this year. So these are areas that we paid a lot of attention to, and we're very proud of all those things that we've done.
Just finally, Richard, as you mentioned, you're there at Abu Dhabi Finance Week. I wonder what opportunities you see specifically in the Middle East region.
Well, it's huge. So just in UAE alone, crypto adoption is close to 40%. I think the same theme is repeated throughout the Middle East, right? So Abu Dhabi was, when I was CEO at Abu Dhabi Global Market, we were one of the first in the world to introduce a crypto regulatory framework to govern this sector in 2018, right? So we are quite ahead of the game then. And you can see Abu Dhabi continue to grow by leaps and bounds on the blockchain, crypto, as well as the AI space, right? So I think that same theme is repeated throughout the Middle East, in Bahrain, in Dubai, and the rest of Middle East, very young demographics, tech savvy, people understand crypto. So, and there are many parts of Middle East, South Africa region where financial inclusion is low, which makes where crypto becomes the only means that people can make payments, can get access to the bank sort of payment system. They can have a store of wealth in the form of stable coins or crypto, and they're much better off. I traveled the region quite extensively, and people come up to thank me in the last few years going through hyperinflationary situation where their domestic fiat currency depreciated sharply. Their family well-being is preserved by holding on to crypto and stable coins. Right? So I have many of these stories repeated throughout the Middle East and throughout the world when I visit many of these countries.
Okay. Thank you so much. Richard Teng, CEO of Binance. Lovely to have you with us on the programme from Abu Dhabi Finance Week. Now, getting back to South Korea, where, of course, we have seen that political turmoil. The latest breaking news is that the President, Yoon, has been banned from leaving the nation. This is according to Yonhap. He is under investigation by the South Korean police over his brief declaration of martial law. You saw the Kospi closing down 2.8%, and this is putting pressure as well now on the won, weaker 0.9% against the dollar. We can also go back to the story of Syria. Of course, over the weekend we saw Bashar al-Assad fleeing to Moscow after rebels advanced into Damascus and toppled his regime. Israel has moved troops into Syrian territory now, while US airstrikes have hit ISIS targets, reflecting concerns about more upheaval in the Middle East amid that power vacuum. We have world leaders grappling with the fall of the dynasty after, of course, more than 50 years in power. And Europe is likely to be affected. We can join Oliver Crook now in Brussels because, Ollie, of course, it was the Syrian conflict that led to the rise of Germany's AfD party. So with the demise of Assad, the question of where the refugees go back on the table, I wonder what's been the European reaction?
Yeah, Lizzie, so listen, it's a very sort of interesting and complex situation that is being observed very closely by a lot of the leaders here and the foreign ministers across Europe. And I think that overall the reaction has been one that is fairly ubiquitous. We heard from Kaja Kallas, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs here at the European Commission, who will hold that title for the next 5 years, saying that the end of Assad's dictatorship is a positive and long-awaited development. It also shows the weakness of Assad's backers, Russia and Iran, which is a sentiment that Joe Biden also made over the weekend, saying that basically this is in part due to how weak Russia and Iran are. But this is very much a very, very, very cautious optimism here in Europe. There's very much wait-and-see mode. A lot of this will come down to how Abu Mohammed al-Jolani decides to sort of proceed through things. He gave a very interesting interview to CNN actually just a couple of days before they managed to topple the Assad regime, where he was talking about basically what Syria needs is institutional governance. He says there needs to be a legal framework in place to deal with minority groups in order to treat them fairly, to make sure that they're protected. These are a lot of the right things to say as far as Western leaders are concerned. The question is, will he be able to, is that his intention, first of all, and second of all, does he have enough consolidated power in order to implement that in what is going to be a very fractured and very sort of complicated situation? And why the sort of Europeans are so concerned with it is when you look at Germany, for example, as you were alluding to, Lizzie, you look at the different sort of immigrant groups within Germany. Number one of that list is Turkey. Number two is now Ukraine. Number three is Syria. There are more than 1 million people that came from Syria and descended from those families that moved into Germany. And when you look at the timeline, the Syrian civil war began in 2011. The AfD was founded in 2013. Merkel let more than 1 million refugees in at 2015. And today, heading into the election 2024, the AfD is polling at about 20%. So for the leaders here and for Europeans, they will be looking at this very, very closely. Potentially more stability in Syria could mean that refugees could go back ultimately. But again, there is so much unknown. We're here to speak to finance ministers here. We're also going to ask them whether or not they're going to have to take into consideration the possible costs of more refugees coming into Europe. That'll be part of the conversation today with the finance ministers who are assembled here in Brussels.
All right, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook on the ground for us ahead of that ECOFIN meeting. We thank you for your reporting. But coming up on the programme, bond traders are hoping for a calm end to the year. But a surprise jump in US inflation could prove another bump in the road. We'll discuss that next. This is Bloomberg.
I can't guarantee anything. I can't guarantee tomorrow, but I can say that if you look at just pre-COVID, we had the greatest economy in the history of our country. And I had a lot of tariffs on a lot of different countries, but in particular China, we took in hundreds of billions of dollars and we had no inflation.
So it's President-elect Donald Trump there speaking about US tariffs on NBC's Meet the Press with Kristen Walker. And to discuss the impact of Trump's tariffs on Europe's economy, I'm joined now by Hetal Mehta, Head of Economic Research at St James's Place. Good to have you with me, Hetal. Good morning. I wonder whether you think the disinflationary impact of cheap Chinese goods being diverted to Europe is going to outweigh the inflationary impact of lower taxes, slower Fed cuts, and then that currency impact to Europe? Or do you think about it completely differently in a different framework to that?
No, I think it is a kind of fair framework to think about things. The form of retaliation that Europe takes if tariffs are levied on Europe, will really matter to the economic outcomes. So we've already seen to some extent that the currencies adjust to reflect the possibility of tariffs. The weaker euro is actually going to increase inflation for Europe in the short term. That's possible. So I think it's very, very difficult to know, depending on how big the tariffs are levied, where they land, and exactly what the retaliation looks like. We know from the first term that there was some kind of tit-for-tat tariffs, but I don't know whether that's something Europe would necessarily want to engage in. But again, it does depend on how broad-based the tariffs are, whether it's on specific goods or more of a kind of a blanket. I'm also quite worried about the starting point of the European economy at this point. The ECB can try and cut rates and keep the euro weak anyway, but it's got the domestic economy is actually quite weak as well right now.
Yeah, I mean, indeed. But if you were on the Governing Council this week in Frankfurt, I wonder whether you'd be more worried about the political turmoil in France and Germany or the spectre of Trump tariffs.
It's not an easy position to be in at the moment, is it? I think in the near term, we don't know how the politics will resolve. We've seen, political instability in Europe kind of flare up and fade. I think for the ECB, the task right now really has to be on the weaker growth. It does also have some reasons not to be very aggressive in cutting interest rates, and I think, like most policymakers, and we also heard this from Jay Powell, until we know what the tariff situation actually looks like, it's very difficult to kind of react to preemptively.
If we could think about the Bank of England as well, we get the UK growth numbers on Friday. I was speaking to Swati Dingber, the archdove of the committee. Just take a listen to a snip of what she said.
We have a very restrictive stance at the moment. That's weighing on living standards. That's weighing on even supply capacity and investments. And that's why we need to sort of start to take that away to some degree so that we start to get normalization back into the economy.
I mean, do you agree with her? Is the UK at risk of a policy error if the Bank of England cuts too gradually?
I think for me, the key concern at the moment is just still how sticky services inflation has been. I agree with the idea of removing some restrictiveness gradually. That part I agree with. And for us, we've been saying for a long time, it's about policy normalization, getting rates to somewhere close to neutral. And I know Swati Dingber has actually been more open about where she thinks the neutral rate is. But does the UK economy need monetary stimulus at this stage when we've also got this near-term fiscal boost that is coming through in terms of public spending? I think is a question mark. So maybe that removal of removal of restrictive rates can happen, but I think there are probably too many corners to look around before we can say that that's appropriate. Maybe second half of next year, we'll have a bit more clarity on that. But for the time being, I think gradual normalization is the part that I agree with.
Yeah, of course, the question of the extent to which those tax rises on employers are passed on to consumers. Hetal, Mehta, Head of Economic Research at St James's Place. Lovely tree, may I say. Thank you for joining us this morning. Now, to another top interview, UBS CEO Sergio Ermotti has said that rising tariffs and global conflicts could increase risk in financial markets next year. He was speaking to Bloomberg at the Abu Dhabi Finance Week, where he weighed in on the European banking system.
It seems to me that Europe is much more preoccupied at country level to address their own political worries, and there is less focus on the European project. So yeah. I'm afraid, it looks like a very good piece of work that has very good ideas, but is unlikely to be implemented in the short term.
The UBS CEO Sergio Ermotti there speaking to Bloomberg's Jumana Basecci. We've got plenty more coming up, so stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Let's set you up for the week with a couple of charts from the terminal. We, of course, have the ECOFIN meeting coming up in Brussels. Oliver Crook's on the ground for us. And a big topic on the docket will be Ukraine. What's next and what does it mean for defence companies? You can see here that EU defence companies are up nearly 60% in 2024. This ECOFIN meeting, by the way, is the first time a UK Chancellor has attended it since Brexit. And a big question for the UK is when is it going to announce that deadline to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence? I spoke to the UK Defence Secretary about it. He said spring, but that is not the sort of certainty that these companies want or that Donald Trump wants either. That's the geopolitics. Let's also turn to the economics, the central banking picture. It's a busy week. The ECB decision, of course, in Frankfurt on Thursday. And you can see that markets have reduced the outlook of a half-point cut, not just at the upcoming meeting, but at the one after it as well. Speaking to ECB officials, they say that a jumbo cut would reek of panic. But just take a look at the weakness in our next chart in Germany. We had those industrial production numbers missing all estimates on Friday. It was the weakest since COVID 2020. How much are Trump tariffs going to weigh on that growth picture even more? A big question ahead of that meeting. But right here on Bloomberg TV, do stick with us because at 9:30 a.m. UK time, we're going to bring you an exclusive interview with the CEO of Audemars Piguet on the outlook for the luxury watch market. And tomorrow, Bloomberg Television is going to bring you live coverage of our inaugural Women, Money and Power event, convening the most influential female voices in finance from around the world to discuss the consequential themes facing the future of business. The opening trade's coming up next. We've got Anna, Critty and Guy taking you through the market open. So stay with us. This is Bloomberg.